Welcome to the Planetary Sciences Shoemaker Lecture. The Shoemaker Lecture is presented every year at the fall AGU. It recognizes excellency in planetary exploration. The lecture honors the life and the work of Eugene Shoemaker. This year we are very privileged to have Alan Stern as our Shoemaker speaker. And Alan is the PI of the New Horizons spacecraft, the first spacecraft to explore objects in the Kuiper belt. And it's a great pleasure to have him here. And if you know of someone who missed this talk, he's going to give a brief version of the talk in this centennial session on Wednesday. So, Alan, thank you.
Well, thank you, Rosalie. It's a pleasure to be here, and I accept this wonderful honor in Eugene Shoemaker's name on behalf of the New Horizons mission team. For those of you, like probably most people in the audience who are involved in spaceflight, you know that it's a team sport. And in the case of New Horizons, 2,500 men and women worked on this project between the time that it was conceived and where we are today. And of course, most of those aren't on the science team, but every one of them should share in the credit of this amazing voyage of discovery. And so, as I said, I accept this honor on behalf of our entire team, but I also want to point out that since the time of the Pluto flyby, we have submitted approximately 150 refereed papers that are either now published or in the literature, and I can't possibly give credit to everyone who's contributed to these papers, but I would like to ask those New Horizons team members who are in the audience to stand up for your applause. And if you would join me, I would appreciate that. Thank you very much. I should say that I'm going to give a little bit of a potpourri of results from both the Pluto system flyby and the first flyby of a primordial Kuiper belt object, 2014 MU-69 or Arrokoth. But there's also a very significant session coming on Wednesday, the Kuiper belt Captain's Tale, with about 10 papers. I'm sorry, that's on Thursday. And then on Wednesday afternoon, there's a poster session with another dozen reports of results from New Horizons or about New Horizons results by non-team members who are contributing from the community. So let me advertise and encourage you to attend both of those sessions. And let me say a word or two about we're so proud that New Horizons was named for the Eugene Shoemaker Lecture. Gene was such a towering figure in this field and taken from us far too soon. I think the first time I really crossed paths with Gene in a professional way was that I hired a postdoc that he had just finished. Somebody who many of you now know is the PI of the Lucy mission, Hal Levison. But even more importantly, and I think poignantly for this lecture, is that most of you probably do not know that Gene was the original imaging team lead for New Horizons, or actually its predecessor, which was a remote sensing investigation on a spacecraft proposal called Pluto Kuiper Express. And I remember when I invited Gene to join our team, he said to me, Alan, I thought I was too old for Cassini, but when I think about Pluto and the Kuiper belt, it's just too much fun. I'm going to have to do it. And so this is particularly important to me that we were named for this lecture. So let me begin. As I think all of you know, New Horizons is the first mission to the third zone of our solar system. Beyond the inner planets and the giant planets is the Kuiper belt. And those of us who were interested in seeing the exploration of Pluto take place had many good reasons to do it, but never quite got it over the top until the discovery of the Kuiper belt and all of the rich science that resulted from that. Understand the origin of our solar system, the architecture of the solar system, and the prevalence of dwarf planets, particularly in the outer solar system. New Horizons was launched in January of 2006 and did a Jupiter gravity assist flyby in February of 2007 to target an intercept of the Pluto system as it crossed the plane of the invariable plane of the solar system in the summer of 2015. And then, after conducting that flyby and spending more than a year and a half sending all the data back, we went on to begin the exploration of the Kuiper belt. And the Kuiper belt is a vast structure. In fact, the spacecraft will be in the Kuiper belt probably until the late 2020s. And we are now in the middle of our first extended mission, which will continue through 2022. And then we expect to propose subsequent extended missions. I think many of you know that New Horizons is a flyby machine, first at Jupiter, then at the Pluto system, and then the KBO Arrokoth. And we are going to begin in the summer of 2020 a search for another KBO target, and we'll see what we turn up. But in addition, the spacecraft is being put to use every day to study the Kuiper belt environment with the plasma, dust, and ultraviolet instruments on board the spacecraft. And we're using the telescopes and imagers on board to study a wide variety, dozens of small Kuiper belt objects and dwarf planets that we either pass close enough to study at a spatial scale that you cannot with any observatory on Earth or in Earth orbit, including the Hubble, or to observe them from unique geometries, particularly to study their phase curves, their shapes, their light curves, their rotation periods, but also to search for satellite systems. And in that regard, I'd like to direct you to the poster session, to Hal Weaver's poster, where there's a very nice result that he's got to show. So let's start at the beginning. This is the best image of Pluto ever made before New Horizons arrived, made with the Hubble Space Telescope and a paper I led back in the late 1990s. And, you know, in order to get a mission to Pluto in the Kuiper belt, you know, we knew that Pluto was interesting. We knew that it had a system of satellites by the time we built the spacecraft. We knew that its surface was covered in multiple extremely volatile materials, molecular nitrogen, carbon monoxide, and methane. We knew through stellar occultations that the planet had an atmosphere. We even knew that the atmospheric pressure was changing with time as Pluto moved around its orbit. We knew many other interesting things, but with an image like this, you can't really do much. What New Horizons did was revolutionize our knowledge of the Pluto system. And what we found was a very, maybe even beyond our best expectations, so complex of a world that we are scratching our heads to understand it today, 4 years later. We found extensive glacial processes, a convecting molecular nitrogen ice glacier the size of Texas and Oklahoma combined, a water ice crust as many had expected, strong evidence for cryovolcanic activity, past and possibly recent, strong evidence for true polar wander, and very likely Pluto is an ocean world. But this only scratches the surface. Now, remember, Pluto is actually a binary planet. And the Pluto-CHARON system is the first true binary of a planetary scale ever detected. CHARON was discovered in the late 1970s by telescopic observations. And the more we learned about the pair, the more we realized it had things to teach us about the origin of the Earth-Moon system, which almost certainly formed through a similar giant impact process, but also the more we realized that the pair is quite dichotomous. And although they were born together, they have evolved to be very different worlds over time. Now, I don't have enough time in this lecture to go into great detail about the satellites and also about KBO Arrokoth, but I want to say a word or two about CHARON because it's turned out to be a spectacular place in and of itself, as interesting as any mid-sized icy satellite of the giant planets. It is a world 1,200 kilometers in diameter, covered in primarily water ice, with a very exotic polar stain consisting of organics that we believe is the result of radiation processes acting on gases transferred by escape off of Pluto's atmosphere and collecting in the cold trap of CHARON's poles. Age dating by crater counts shows that its surface is as old as the system, approximately 4 billion years old. You can see the east-west tectonic belt, the extensional tectonic belt across the equator, which we believe was caused by the freezing of a former ocean early in Charon's lifetime. We see a north-south dichotomy in the terrains. I think you can see it yourself, the much more rugged northern terrains, and then the flooded but still old southern terrains. Our composition spectrometers see water ice all across the surface, as I pointed out, but in addition, we see ammonia or ammoniated molecules in outcrops, primarily around in crater ejecta in a variety of places. And our best searches for an atmosphere down to levels that are close to the very tenuous lunar atmosphere reveal nothing. And in all of these attributes, this world is entirely different from Pluto. Now, in addition, the binary is surrounded by 4 small satellites, which you see here, Styx, Nix, Kerberos, and Hydra, in order of their distance from the binary. And they are 4 interesting worlds themselves. They have unusually high albedos, in fact, even higher than Pluto's average albedo, despite all the volatile transport taking place there. They're all complex and rapid rotators, something that we didn't expect before the flyby. They have water ice, and we have also detected ammonia on the satellite surfaces. And they're also age dated to be very old. And that old age, combined with the fact that all 4 of those satellites are in Pluto's equatorial plane, where Charon also orbits, is very strong evidence that the 4 satellites were formed in the giant impact, and that they are additional clues to the mechanics of that giant impact that happened so long ago. But I want to turn to Pluto now and walk through some of the highlights of what New Horizons was able to discover. And I'll start with Pluto's atmosphere, which, as I said, we knew existed since the late 1980s from stellar occultations. But New Horizons, with a variety of instruments, primarily radio science and the ultraviolet spectrometer, were able to tell us many new things, discover many new species, nitriles and hydrocarbons, in addition to the methane, carbon monoxide, molecular nitrogen that was known to be there. Was able to measure the temperature pressure profiles down to the base for the first time and determine that the pressure at the base of the atmosphere is 11 microbars. But we found differing surface temperatures, and that's almost certainly related to a combination of topographical and diurnal effects, because we have an entry and an exit profile half a planet away. In addition to that, the upper atmospheric temperature profile showed that the upper atmosphere is very cool, tens of degrees cooler than we thought it was from modeling based upon stellar occultation events. Because it's cooler, it's more compact. But in addition, because it's cooler, the escape rates are exponentially lower. And we actually found that the escape regime is not the hydrodynamic blow-off regime that so many papers had predicted before the flyby, but actually a genes escape regime, very much like a terrestrial planet. We don't know what the coolant is that's causing this. There are a variety of ideas ranging from hazes in the upper atmosphere, and you can see those hazes in the lower image, to molecular coolants, but this is not a settled matter. We did find many dozens of haze layers with puzzling concentric kind of coherence stretching over 200 kilometers in altitude in Pluto's sky. And although our radio science instrument was only able to set an upper limit of about 1,000 electrons per cc in the occultation profile that it obtained, our ultraviolet spectrometer was able to detect singly ionized nitrogen. So we know that there's an ionosphere there. And there's a very large downstream solar-wind interaction region that our plasma instruments were able to detect out to hundreds of Pluto radii behind the planet as the spacecraft receded. There's a lot of work to do to understand Pluto's present-day atmosphere, and as I'll refer to later, there's a lot of work to understand both the orbital and seasonal cycles and what we call mega-seasonal cycles that are very analogous to Milankovitch cycles on the Earth due to obliquity shifts. So come on in the game. There's plenty of room, and there's a NASA grant program for this for outer planet research. Now, probably the most spectacular single feature on the surface of Pluto is the nitrogen glacier that we named SPUTNIK Planitia. This is about little north of 1 million square kilometers of terrain that comprises the western lobe of the heart-shaped feature on Pluto that you see there in the upper right in the context image in the little box, in which you see in this spherical projection of New Horizons images with stretched color. Now, this glacier sits in what we believe to be a vast impact basin caused by the collision of a 100-kilometer class object with Pluto in the ancient past that excavated this basin and probably uplifted the mountains that range from 3 to 5 kilometers in altitude around it, which then became a cold trap to these volatiles of primarily molecular nitrogen, which intimately control both the atmospheric cycles and the flow of all of these volatiles, all three of the important volatiles around the surface over time. It is both a sink and a source for this transport of a scale that we didn't see anywhere else in the outer solar system. But it's even better because, as Bill McKinnon and others have so well written about, this glacier is convecting. We see in the northern reaches of it, and you can see in the geological map to the right, many dozens of convection cells that we estimate have turnover timescales of 500,000 or 1 million years. And then to the south, when we get closer to the equator, those convection cells disappear, but we see very large numbers, thousands of sublimation pits, indicating again the active transport of volatiles out of the glacier and around the planet. But it's even better because searches for craters on the surface of SPUTNIK, again, north of 1 million square kilometers, have not found even one. And the highest resolution imaging goes down to 70 or 80 meters per pixel, which corresponds to impactors that are just a couple of tens of meters across. And with no craters on such a large expanse, we can set a constraint on the crater retention age of the surface, and we find that depending upon what model you use, that this surface cannot be older than perhaps 10 to 30 million years old. It may be much younger. If you look at the middle image, you will see those arrows that show strong evidence, in fact, incontrovertible evidence for dynamics in the glacier. There are currents, the glacier is moving. We also see evidence for glacial recharge. The image at the bottom, which is a topographic map, shows that down that chute, maybe we can use the cursor here, down this chute from the mountains 4 or 5 kilometers above the plain where SPUTNIK Glacier is, a vast pool of molecular nitrogen ran down that chute and spilled out in the recent past. And so we know that there's a kind of hydrological cycle taking place with the nitrogen in SPUTNIK. Now, I said that SPUTNIK is very young, and I don't think anybody expected terrains quite that young on Pluto, less than 1,000th the age of the planet. But immediately to the west of SPUTNIK, we find saturated terrains, terrains that are saturated in craters to the point that their crater retention age is the polar opposite. It is 4 billion or more years old. And in other places, like in eastern Tombau Regio and others, we find intermediate ages. So we have very strong evidence that Pluto has shown geological evolution all the way across its history. And for such a small planet with a diameter of only 2,400 kilometers, approximately the distance from Denver to the east coast of the United States, I think this is a surprising finding that really none of us expected, that Pluto could be not just perhaps episodically active, but continuously active on virtually every geological timescale. And yet that is the case. That is what we found in this dwarf planet. Here's a natural color image of Pluto made by New Horizons. We knew before the flyby what Pluto's average color was, but we did not expect to see such strong variegation across the surface. And to illustrate that point, here's a stretched color image using 3 of the filters in our color camera, the blue, the red, and the near-infrared channels. And you can see that the colors correlate strongly with the geology. There's a great difference between the dark mare-like region we call Cthulhu informally, to Sputnik, the glacier, to the northern pole at the top. Some of this is related to volatile transport, and some of this is related to other processes, such as the deposition of those organic haze particles that are silting out of the atmosphere over time. We also see strongly varied surface composition. This is also very important, that whereas the Sputnik Glacier is primarily nitrogen, we see water ice outcrops that tell us that the crust of Pluto we already knew was made of very strong materials because nitrogen can't support the kind of steep topography that's seen across the surface. But because the composition spectrometers only measure the veneer at the very surface, and we see primarily the volatiles, it was very important to establish that there are bare spots that actually show that water ice crust peeking out. And we see places that are much more heavily enriched in the methane and the carbon monoxide and so forth and so on. This is a very complex world. Let me just give you a few more examples of some of what makes Pluto so enticing. Here's one of them. We have what we think is very good evidence for a series of volcanic edifices, constructs. This one is about the size of Mauna Loa in both height and in diameter, and it shows no craters on its flanks, which indicates a surface crater retention age of less than 100 million years. So this was either recently constructed or recently resurfaced. And there are 3 of these that have now been identified, and there'll be a paper by Kelsey Singer that's coming out, will be submitted next year on this topic. But in addition, Dale Cruikshank and his team at NASA Ames have seen and now published other evidence, other locales for other kinds of cryovolcanic activity on Pluto's surface. If that wasn't enough, those Milankovitch cycles that I spoke about, the obliquity cycles that were actually discovered by a dynamicist, a theoretician, Tony Dobrovolskis, in the late 1990s, which have an amplitude about an order of magnitude greater than Earth's Milankovitch cycles, plus and minus over 20 degrees in the case of Pluto. These drive strong seasonal cycles that in turn, for a vapor pressure equilibrium atmosphere, drive very strong pressure fluctuations. Now, the libration timescale, the precession timescale is almost 4 million years. So about 1,000 of these cycles have taken place over the age of the solar system. And some very simple modeling that I did with a group of colleagues on the New Horizons team has indicated that the pressure can fluctuate by many orders of magnitude, and that Pluto's present roughly 10 microbar surface pressure is near the minimum. And that in the most extreme cases, the atmospheric pressure can exceed the base pressure at Mars by more than an order of magnitude, and that we can get to the nitrogen triple point in these extreme cases. And there is some circumstantial evidence we see in some of the geomorphology across the surface for dissected terrains, for fluvial or fluvial-like terrains. There's at least one example of what looks like a frozen lake of nitrogen in a hanging mountain valley. So we think that over these 4 million year timescales, it's possible that Pluto transforms itself into an entirely different world. And if that wasn't enough, we also have evidence that Pluto has a global water ocean on the inside. And the root of the evidence for this, of course, we can make interior models, and as you go down in depth and the pressure and the temperature increase, you reach a point where the liquid water should form. But the key clue to this from an observational standpoint is that Sputnik itself is diametrically opposite to CHARON, which is in a synchronous orbit around Pluto. And why it should lie at precisely that location could be an accident, but the odds are extremely low. It's much more likely that there's a mass concentration below the glacier, which Francis Nimmo and colleagues have written about in Nature and in other venues. And they believe that the formation of the basin caused the liquid water in the ocean to upwell and create this mass concentration because the liquid water is more dense than the molecular nitrogen. And this mass concentration, of course, only reaches a stable equilibrium when it's diametrically opposed to CHARON. So we have pretty good evidence that Pluto is another of these water-ocean worlds. And I could go on, but for lack of time, I won't. Really, there's something for everyone at this planet. And I think that with only the 40% of the surface that we were able to see on a single fast flyby, the variety of different timescales, the many geological and atmospheric puzzles, this planet is begging for an orbiter. I won't beg you for it, but maybe the Decadal Survey will. Now, I want to now turn to our extended mission and our extended mission flyby target, the KBO Arrokoth, and I want to give you a feeling for the scale of this target compared to Pluto. Again, from one side of Pluto to the other is about the distance from Denver, say, to Washington, D.C., and we're going to take these New Horizons color images and zoom up on Sputnik, and then we're going to put Arrokoth there on the surface so you can see it's very small. It's basically the size of a single mountain block in the mountains west of Sputnik. And so we took on the challenge of not only finding, but then chasing down this little 35-kilometer target a billion miles beyond Pluto and chasing it down in the darkness of the Kuiper belt. It's probably lit not very differently than this room. And over a 3-year flight, a 3.5-year flight actually, we accomplished just that. We had a very successful flyby of Arrokoth on the 1st of January. Actually, closest approach was 33 minutes into the new year, 2019. We targeted that flyby to go over the celestial north pole of the target and to fly by at a distance that was almost 4 times closer to that KBO than we flew by Pluto. I don't have time to describe what an amazing technical challenge this team rose to find this little target to begin with, and then, having tracked it for only 1% of its 4-century orbit, to hunt it down and to make a flyby that was even more accurate in both time and impact parameter than the Pluto flyby. But they pulled it off. So meet Arrokoth, formerly 2014 MU-69. Now, we knew when we first found it with the Hubble that it's a cold classical Kuiper belt object. And what does that mean? It means, most importantly, that this object, which falls in the cold classical subpopulation of the Kuiper belt, is one of those rare objects in the Kuiper belt, the entire cold classical population is, that actually formed out at this great distance of 40-plus astronomical units. As many of you know, from the scattered disk to the populations that are in the mean motion resonances, most of the objects now in the Kuiper belt were transported out from the giant planet region by one process or another. But the cold classicals appear to have formed in situ. And so this was an opportunity to study a really wild and woolly planetesimal, which had been unperturbed, never warmed, never closer to the sun, and to see, if you will, a bedrock sample of what the formation processes in the distant outer solar system gave us. And they gave us this object, 33 kilometers in length, a contact binary. As you can see, the 2 lobes of the binary don't look like they have had very much violence done to them in the merger event. They seem to have just settled together very gently. I'll say more about that in a few minutes. But from the beginning, from the time that we saw this very first image, not this image, but the very first image of the contact binary, we knew that we had something special. And it's special in many ways. Maybe not as good as Pluto, but potentially even more important in some ways. Now, just looking at the surface albedo, you can see there's a lot of structure there. This is not at all a uniformly reflective object. There are lots of coherent types of albedo patterns, from curvilinear features to bright white spots. Many of these are often correlated with low spots in the topography on the surface. We see diffuse bright zones. We see dark zones as well. I won't pretend that we understand all of that, but it's an active subject of research, and it certainly stood out for all of us from the very beginning as an immediate puzzle as to how this surface sitting out in the space weathering environment for 4 billion years could maintain itself with such a complex albedo pattern on its surface. When we look at its color, by contrast, the color is almost homogeneous. There are a few places that are a little bluer, but they're still red. And I should have said on the previous chart, everything you were looking at, even the bright stuff, is dark. The very brightest places on this KBO have an I over F of only about 25%. The color is almost completely homogeneous with just a few places that are less red in their slope, and this is an exaggerated false color diagram, so the things that are bluer, but still red. And when we compare the color of this target and all of the pixels on it to other populations, like the centaurs that are escapees from the Kuiper belt, or the other cold classicals, we find that Mu-69 or Arrokoth is pretty typical, which is comforting because this is the only cold classical New Horizons will be able to fly by. We are now passing the outer fringes of the cold classical region. We also have a composition, mid-infrared composition spectrum of the target, which shows us methanol on its surface and is consistent with the presence of widespread water ice as well. When we compare this to other objects, we find that the surface is very similar to the Centaur Pholus, similar to some KBOs like 2002 VE95, which is itself a Plutino and a mean motion resonant population, and that Mare-like Cthulhu dark region on the surface of Pluto where those organics have been silting out over time that we talked about a little earlier. When we try to understand what volatiles are and aren't on the surface, and Carrie Liss has done the most recent work on this, we have a pretty good understanding of why the nitrogen and the carbon monoxide and the methane, for example, are not there, because this small body cannot retain them against sublimation over long time scales. But by contrast, water ice and methanol do very well over these long time scales. And so in a sense, we can rationalize what we see in terms of surface composition. And of course, the methanol is seen in other contexts as well, including in many protoplanetary disks around other stars. So I'll turn to the reflectance and the geology for a few minutes. First, you can see in the lower left in the B panel that those albedo patterns are pretty stark. We have contrasts of factors of about 4 to 1 in I over F across the surface, with the very brightest region being at the neck, where the two lobes of the contact binary form, but we see other bright curvilinear regions as well, and some particularly dark regions. We are working hard on understanding the geology. John Spencer has a paper submitted to Science with the first, I think, really competent, carefully considered geologic maps. And from that, we're learning a number of things. One is that we're doing crater counting. We've got multiple people like Stuart Robbins and Kelsey Singer doing those crater counts, and they're classifying the craters according to their confidence that the hole in the ground is actually caused by an impact crater as opposed to some other process, using depth to diameter ratios and raised rims as telltales of higher confidence features, for example. And when all is said and done, and we make our plots of the crater population versus crater diameter, we find some interesting things. One is that the surface, using modern models like Sarah Greenstreet's model for the impactor population on a target in the cold classicals, age dates again to something primordial, 4+ billion years old. But in addition, just like the results that we obtained at Pluto and CHARON, which you may have read about but I didn't speak about, using crater counts on Pluto and CHARON, and now also on Arrokoth, we can show that the Kuiper belt is surprisingly deficient in small impactors. And why that's the case, I think, is going to be a subject that people work on for a long time. But we have a consistent result at both the Pluto orbit that, of course, ranges from 30 to 50 astronomical units, and at Arrokoth, which is in a nearly circular orbit at 44 astronomical units. So in addition to teaching us about planetesimals and KBOs and dwarf planets and their satellite systems, the results from these two flybys are also teaching us about the general Kuiper Belt population and its size structure at scales that we can't hope to measure from the Earth with any telescope that exists or is currently planned, because we can probe down to crater sizes of just hundreds of meters corresponding to impactors of just tens of meters in diameter. Okay, now the next thing that I want to talk about regarding Arrokoth has to do with the larger of the two lobes. And if you look at where those yellow arrows are, you'll see a series of like-sized and relatively similarly shaped mounds, 8 or so of them, that comprise the entirety of the sunlit face of the larger lobe. What are these? We would like to know. Perhaps they are the subunits out of which Arrokoth was constructed. Perhaps they're due to some evolutionary process, like some early thermal evolution that took place shortly after this object was formed. But that, of course, depends upon the timing of the formation of the target relative to the early radioactive decay in the early solar nebula. Now, if you look at the smaller lobe, you don't see these structures. And that may be because of the large crater-like feature, which we informally call Marilyn, which may have resurfaced the smaller lobe. Whether that was before the merger of the pair or after, we don't know. But regardless, I think one of the most important problems, one of the most important open problems regarding this object is exactly what those lobes are, and not those lobes, but those mounds are on the larger lobe, and what they have to tell us about the accretion process or the evolutionary processes of these Kuiper Belt objects. Now, we have been working pretty hard, and Bill McKinnon's got a paper that's been submitted to Science on the origin story for Arrokoth. And Derek Richardson and his graduate student, Julian Moronic, have been doing some sophisticated PKD-grav simulations of this merger event. And they've been doing various trials where they vary the strength, the cohesion, the friction, and the impact speeds, and have some very important results. So I want to show you first a result of one of those simulations at an impact speed of only 10 meters per second. And look what happens. There's no merger. The two objects glance off one another and fly off to infinity at only 10 meters a second. Now keep in mind that for binary accretion models, the kind of accretion models that we used a lot in the 20th century, before pebble accretion and local cloud collapse was thought about very much. The typical impact speeds would not be 10 meters per second, but hundreds of meters per second in the cold classical population. So even if we slow it down to 10 meters per second, these simulations cannot produce a merger. Now let's try it at 5 meters a second. And it does better, but it does not produce the contact binary that we see, which has no evidence of the kind of violence that this kind of 5 meter per second impact speed results in. So let's try again. And the last simulation that I'll show you is at 2.5 meters per second. Voila. We get something very reminiscent of Arrokoth. This is extremely strong evidence that Arrokoth was formed in a local cloud collapse at very gentle collision speeds, very unlike the kind of binary collision, Aufbau building up process that so many papers on the origin of planetesimals wrote about in the late 20th century, and is, I think, the strongest evidence yet for the pebble cloud collapse type models. And it all comes from the result of this flyby. Now there's more. Now, as I said, Bill McKinnon's got this paper that's going through refereeing at Science that speaks about this local cloud collapse and why the velocity regimes that it takes to make the merger are such strong evidence for local collapse of this kind. But there's more evidence. If I push the right button, I can show it to you. Undo that and redo that. Let's talk about the remarkable shape of Arrokoth, which as a contact binary is itself remarkable, but we have images not only of the front side, but you can see we look back at the target after the flyby. You can see it running by in the upper right against the star field, and we can use the positions of those stars against Arrokoth and knowing from the SPICE files exactly where the target is relative to the spacecraft, where the spacecraft is, and we can reconstruct a shape model, which John Spencer's paper goes into in quite a bit of detail, but I think I can best illustrate with this set of images that show how flattened the two lobes actually are, that they're not three-dimensional spheres, but highly flattened, almost like rocks that you would skip off a river or a pond. This is also completely unexpected and is probably a clue, a further clue to the formation process that may indicate that in that local collapse cloud that there was an angular momentum process that collapsed down into a disk and caused these objects to form in this flattened way. There's more, because the other interesting clue is that the three principal axes of the two lobes are very closely aligned. All three of the axes, the three principal axes, are aligned to within less than 1/10 of a radian, 5 degrees, 7 degrees, something like that. And if you construct Monte Carlo models to ask how often in a random process this would occur, of course, the odds are very, very small, a few percent or less. What this, we believe, is telling us is that some process, perhaps aerodynamic or probably more likely tidal, caused these two objects, as they were orbiting and evolving, to co-align, and we think those were tidal processes. This is really a remarkable set of clues between the shape and the principal axis alignment and the requirement for a low-speed, gentle merger that we see both in the geology and in the intact nature of the binary, that give us this kind of a formation scenario where a small local cloud collapse took place, perhaps into a planar structure where individual objects in the system were accreting onto one lobe or the other of the binary. Others were being ejected from the system. As they were being ejected, this hardened the binary. It took angular momentum and energy out of the system, and the binary shrank together. And as they became very close, within a few radii of one another, the tidal forces could take hold, and that this process was slow enough for that tidal evolution to actually align the principal axes, as I described earlier, and result in this almost docking of the two lobes. In fact, in the first paper published on Arrokoth in Science in May, which I led, we used the word docking throughout the paper, and the editors of Science refused to let us use that word because they said docking is something controlled by human beings or some intelligent, in some intelligence. And so we use the word merger now a lot more. But regardless, this is the formation scenario, and I really want to point you to this trio of papers, which is making its way through refereeing at Science. Spencer et al., Grundy et al., and McKinnon et al., that will appear, I hope, early next year on this object in quite a bit more detail than we were able to put in the first paper, and which concerned the geology and color and composition and the formation scenario of this object. And I also should point out one more thing, that there's another possibility in this hardening of the binary process and the alignment of the lobes that Bill McKinnon writes about, and that's the possibility that if this all took place very early, that the headwind between the pressure-supported gas and the Keplerian orbit of these two objects as they were coming together may have created some aerodynamic forces that also played a role, possibly even a dominant role, in the creation of this binary, in addition to the other processes that I spoke about. So this is where I'm going to wrap up this story. If nothing else, New Horizons has been a mission of delayed gratification. For those of us who wanted to see a mission to Pluto and the Kuiper Belt, it took 14 years from the first study until a decadal survey ranked it as a top priority. Then it took 4 years to build it and get it launched, and then it took almost precisely a decade to fly it across the solar system, where the real science began in 2015 with the flyby of the Pluto system. And I don't think Arrokoth was any less spectacular. The lessons that we have learned from New Horizons, the lessons that this team of 2,500 men and women who conceived, designed, tested, and flew New Horizons across the solar system have literally not rewritten a textbook, but written a textbook from scratch about the Pluto system and planetesimals in the Kuiper Belt. Now, if there's anything we know about the dwarf planets of the Kuiper Belt, it's that they are a diverse population. There are approximately a dozen that are known, and they are just as diverse in their colors, their densities, their compositions, their satellite systems, and the presence or absence of atmospheres as the four terrestrial planets. And the various subpopulations of the Kuiper Belt, and I hope that we get to visit another subpopulation with New Horizons in the coming years. But those subpopulations, from the Plutinos to the other mean motion resonant objects, to the scattered disk objects, to the various kinds of classicals like the cold and hot classicals, are all begging for further exploration. New Horizons is in perfect health. Every system on the spacecraft and every instrument on the spacecraft are working perfectly. The RTG has power to run the spacecraft for approximately 20 more years. There's more fuel on board the tank than it took to do the flyby of Arrokoth. And this team wants to keep exploring. So we expect to write another senior mission, extended mission proposal in 2022. And since the Kuiper Belt continues further outward, if we're successful in that proposal, I expect there'll be another 3 years down the road. Because now that we're here, where the spacecraft was built to explore, we want to get everything that we possibly can out of it, using the spacecraft as an environmental monitor for plasma and dust and gas, as an observatory in the Kuiper Belt, and hopefully to make one more flyby. But whether or not New Horizons can make that flyby, many of you will be involved in the decadal survey. And I think that what this mission has shown us is that for the next generation of missions, the second quartile of missions in the 21st century, that there's a tremendous scientific opportunity for the next stages of exploration of KBOs and KBO dwarf planets. And so with that, I will say thank you and take any questions.
Thank you. Do we have any questions for Alan? Yes, I see 1, 2 already.
Jack?
Alan, have you or anyone on your team compared Triton information from Voyager with degraded New Horizons data to the same quality and done comparative planetology on two objects with similar compositions and sizes?
Well, I guess that's an opportunity to say we ought to go back to Triton and the Neptune system as well, and that would teach us a lot. As you know, Triton is a captured dwarf planet of the Kuiper Belt with twice the mass of Pluto, but probably much more highly thermally processed due to that capture event. And we have not done a specific paper like you've talked about, but there are many similarities in the atmosphere and the volatiles in the Triton system and on Pluto. And probably a lot that it can teach us as well about the kinds of geologic processes that take place. But unfortunately, the data sets that we have on Triton from Voyager are really primitive compared to the data sets we have from New Horizons. We don't have the same in terms of high-resolution imaging. We don't have the compositional mapping. And even the ultraviolet spectrometer that we could fly, built in the 1970s compared to the 2000s, there's just a great disparity in the two data sets. But I think a proposal like that, Jack, might be a one that was well received.
Okay, I
Nancy in the back.
One question.
Yes.
How many revolutions would be required to damp out the non-synchronous rotation of the two halves of Aricot? Is that consistent with the Kepler scenario?
Yeah, so if you didn't hear the question, is how many revolutions of the binary pair would it take to damp the system to the end state that we see? If Bill McKinnon's in the audience and he knows an actual number, I can say it's a lot. And of course, the orbital periods are relatively short, so a lot doesn't add up to a lot of clock time. Bill, you're right here.
It depends on how close they are or what processes brought them in close. The spin down though can be relatively fast if they are near each other, and I'll be talking about that on Thursday.
Okay, and if you couldn't hear Bill, he's going to give a talk on that subject Thursday. There's the bottom line. Thank you, Bill. Anybody else?
Oh, yes.
How much would it cost? New Horizons flies at a cost of millions of dollars per year, not tens of millions of dollars per year. So it depends on how far it would take to fly to that KBO. 7 years versus 3 years is a factor of 2. So what we know is that because we don't have to write that proposal till 22, and we can only do searches in the summertime because that's when that part of the sky is in the nighttime sky, that in the summer of 20 and the summer of 21, we're going to apply the largest telescopes with the biggest wide field imagers, like the Subaru telescope, to that search. And if we can't find a target, then we'll write an extended mission proposal that's absent a close flyby. And if we do have a target, then we'll know what year and how many years it will take, and therefore what it would cost. But compared to the roughly $900 million that's been spent so far, it will be peanuts. Yeah.
We have one more. Greg?
Greg?
Alan, I have a comment and a quick question. The comment is that fantastic is far too weak a word to describe the wondrous discoveries that New Horizons and this remarkable team have made. So when you write the new book of the outer solar system, let's come up with a new word to describe what this, that encapsulates the discoveries that you guys collectively have made. It's truly awesome. My question is inspired by a mind-expanding notion that Penny Boston laid on us this morning at the Sagan lecture. I know you were there. Penny said, someday, as she reminded us, the sun will nova and the sun will become a red giant, and Pluto will all of a sudden be the Goldilocks in the habitable zone. And so a question for you to speculate, just given the rich inventory of materials that the team has already discovered in the Pluto-CHARON system, what might that system look like in 1 billion years after it becomes in the habitable zone?
Well, let's see. I have to thank Greg twice. First, thank you for the compliment for our mission team. And secondly, I'm not sure if the question was naive or if you actually know that I wrote and published a paper in 2003 in astrobiology on this very subject of what would happen to Pluto and the icy dwarf planets of the Kuiper belt when the sun goes red giant for several hundred million years. Put very simply, I'll just put it in layman's terms, the temperature in the Kuiper belt will be comparable to the present-day temperature at Miami Beach. And so the water ice crust of Pluto will melt and the organics will become solvents or sedimentary products in that ocean. Those interior ocean worlds will become exterior ocean worlds like the Earth for several hundred million years, which is a very interesting timescale for astrobiology, I think.
We have time for one more quick question. Yes.
I don't see it. You see one? Oh, right in the middle.
Okay. Yes.
Because the question, I believe, is do the crater counts on Aricot line up with what you expect for the small body population out at 44 astronomical units? They do now, as a result, I think, well, I didn't quite mean it the way it came out. So for modern models, post what we learned about the crater size frequency distributions on the surfaces of Pluto and CHARON, they do fit pretty well to first order. But if you would have asked that question before the flyby of Pluto, say in the Stone Age 7 years ago, the answer would be it's quite surprising. And it calls into question how that truncated population came to be, what production or loss processes created that, and that's still an open question. So we're getting a consistent answer. It's very different from what we thought pre-New Horizons, but we don't really understand the basis behind what nature is showing us.
Well, let's thank Alan again,
Thank
and
you.
I'll present you with the real thing, and we can, yeah.
Don't go anywhere, because we do have another prize lecture coming up right after this, so stick around.
And before our new prize lecture, I would like to present this year's Ronald Greeley Early Career Award to Z Zhang, if you could come up here. The Early Career Award is named after Professor Ron Greeley, who was a friend and mentor to many of us. This year's winner, Z Zhang, is assistant professor of planetary science at University of California, Santa Cruz, and an expert on planetary climate, dynamics, and atmospheric chemistry. And I would like Cindy Greeley to, come up here so we could take a picture. And let's congratulate Z. Okay. And now we come to the presentation of the Fred Whipple Award and the lecture. The Whipple Award recognizes significant contributions to the field of planetary science, and the award was established in honor of Fred Whipple. This year's award goes to Faith Villas. She's a senior scientist at the Planetary Science Institute. And Faith has had a long and productive career pioneering remote sensing of solar system objects, and particularly pushing our remote sensing capabilities through instrument designs and telescope observations. So Faith.